Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session where we celebrate the launch of the biography of Jan Tinbergen. My name is Philip Hans Francis. I'm affiliated with the Econometric Institute, which was, by the way, founded by Jan Tinbergen together with Henri Theil here at Erasmus School of Economics. We are very proud that we can host this session. We have a lecture and we have a plenary panel discussion. But it's very important to know that this book was just recently published by Cambridge University Press, and it was already started in 2017 by the lead author of this book. And now today, finally, we can present it here out in the open. There has already been a Dutch version, which I could read, and is a very, very pleasant read, a very nice book. The English version, I can't say if it's better or not, but it's in English, and it's very pleasant to read as well. I can strongly recommend it. But first, I introduce you to Professor Arjo Klamer, who will be the moderator of this afternoon's session. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a great honor for me to be able to moderate a session on the publication of the biography of Jan Tinbergen by Erwin Dekker. I didn't study at the Erasmus University, but at the University of Amsterdam, econometrics. And the inspiration was, at that time when I was a high school student, it was Jan Tinbergen. And it is wonderful to see how Jan Tinbergen comes to life in this great biography. And I'm also very pleased to say that Jim Heckman, a well-known economist from the University of Chicago, got also interested in the work of Jan Tinbergen, wrote an essay about the work of Jan Tinbergen, the social engagement of Jan Tinbergen, which also he displays in his own work. And so it is a great honor also that he is also going to share his thoughts on Jan Tinbergen with us. After that, I will have a discussion with, among others, Philip Hans Francis and with Esther Miriam Sent, and of course the author himself, Erwin Dekker. And you have the opportunity to pose your questions at the Q&A, and please, I welcome you to do so to enliven our session at the end. But first, I would like to welcome Jim Heckman to share his thoughts about Jan Tinbergen and his legacy.
Well, I'm honored to be here. I would prefer not to give too much of a formal lecture, but to describe what I think the impact of Tinbergen was and what this book does in terms of providing deeper insight into what motivated Tinbergen. And I think the book, as has been said, is well written. I think it actually presents an interesting perspective on the life of a person who in mainstream economics is probably better known for his work on econometrics and social planning, development planning later in his career. But there's certainly a body of work going back in econometrics to the 1930s. There's an econometric technique called indirect least squares, which is still used today, which was pioneered by Tinbergen in the course of his work in terms of developing the structure of understanding the economy and trying to do empirical work. There's an interesting tradition in Holland, or in the Netherlands, I should say, where much of the work in economics has been motivated by very empirical concerns, people trying to solve social policy problems. I speak now from Tinbergen on. It also includes Theil, who was, of course, a student of Tinbergen. Theil was my colleague here for many years, and we taught some classes together. And Theil and Tinbergen both had this profound motivation. They were different in their perspectives about social policy and particulars, but they were both motivated by trying to understand the data and to devise social policies that were empirically based. And I consider that to be an interesting theme that runs throughout the book and the life of Tinbergen. I mean, to me, it's kind of amazing. It's something we don't see much these days in economics, that he did not have training, per se, in economics. I mean, he didn't take a PhD in economics from anybody. Maybe Paul Ehrenfest, who was working in thermodynamics and was a world-renowned physicist in Leiden, friend of Einstein, friend of Fermi, a real player in the world of nuclear physics and physics generally in the 1920s and 30s. So that, I guess, I had learned only from this book that Ehrenfest had developed on his own interest in economics and economic policy, and seeing the relevance of applying economic models, physical models, models of physics to understand the economy. But but it's quite interesting then that Tinbergen's training, and I gather much actually of Theil's training, although Theil was a student of Tinbergen, that many, these two famous Dutch economists gained their traction mainly from trying to understand empirical problems. It's also true, of course, another famous Dutch economist, Charles Koopmans, had a background in physics as well, and converted himself from a mathematical physicist to an econometrician, and then later a major economic theorist. So it's an interesting tradition of the transition from physics to economics, but using the tools of physics and the standards of physics. In other words, the standards of trying to look at the structure of data, to build models and understand how well they explain the data, or motivated by economic problems, but using data to test those models. And so there's no question that that's very, very central, it seems to me, to the history of Dutch econometrics. I can't speak for the current state today. I don't know everybody. I know a lot of very good Dutch econometricians and economists who are doing similar things, linking data and models and going forward and testing. But what I find interesting about Tinbergen, and when I read the book, I felt in some sense, there's a famous story about Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton allegedly was motivated by, when he did his physics, he was motivated by the desire to actually to understand the nature of God. He thought he was discovering God's mind. He was a deist. I mean, he really had this idea of the world being designed by God. And I think many physicists, even to this day, think about it in that way. But I think the way that was taken, I took from the book, the way that Tinbergen approached these problems, it's interesting to have the background and understanding that Tinbergen was deeply motivated by social questions. There were many economists in the 1930s who entered the profession because of the Great Depression, who really wanted to understand the economy in a way that had not been understood, and who, like Tinbergen, really believed that there needed to be some way to plan economies, to gain central planning, to try to rectify some of the worst excesses of capitalism that had led to the Great Depression. So Tinbergen was in part of a group in that regard, but he stood out from the group because not only did he have this motivation, like Newton in some ways, but unlike Newton, what he did was that he had developed ideas. He developed even the framework for understanding the questions that were in front of the economy. So he wasn't looking for God so much. Maybe the book actually suggested maybe he was looking for divine replacement in some sense, social planning and government policy planning, but some way to essentially right the affairs of state and to correct what Tinbergen, I felt strongly about, namely poverty, inequality, and social injustices that he saw first in Holland, and then as he went around the world to developing countries. But it's a remarkable career, and the part that I find most charming, most important, charming may be the wrong word, but the most important motivation, in my opinion, was that Tinbergen had this deep willingness to understand the other side and to really try to synthesize knowledge. So he clearly had an understanding of the relevant Marxist economic theory of the day, which was very, very common. People like Koleski, there were many people around who were, and Oscar Lange and so forth, there were many people who were really formalizing Marx in a way that hadn't been done before and providing content. And in Tinbergen's language and the language of a lot of physicists, by providing a framework for having a meaningful discussion about competing points of view, meaningful not only theoretically, but meaningful empirically, in the sense of understanding what should be changed, what we should learn, what is in fact a valid criticism, what isn't, and how we should go forward. But I felt in reading this book that I really came to a deeper appreciation of what Tinbergen was all about. He was deeply socially motivated, and you can see that in his writings. I mean, I think what it's easy to overlook some of Tinbergen's great contributions. He did, of course, develop one of the first business cycle models for the League of Nations. And his discussion of the League of Nations model triggered a whole line of research. I mean, back in the late 30s, you had people like Keynes, you had people like Milton Friedman, the young Milton Friedman, and many others who were very actively engaged in reading Tinbergen's work, seeing how we could do better, and raising a whole set of questions about how do you build a model from data and then use the same or similar data to test that model. So there was a deep, deep set of issues, but the crucial thing, and this seemed to be the recurring feature of Tinbergen's work, is that he was deeply motivated by the problem. And the frameworks were developed to create a understanding, a deeper understanding. And it wasn't just the kind of aesthetic enterprise, it was really to create an understanding that would lead to policy. So Tinbergen, I think it's his early socialist training, his early sense of social responsibility. It sounds like the Tinbergen family, which of course produced 2 Nobel laureate for children, was really quite a remarkable breeding ground. And in terms of contemporary discussions about family, early childhood, he was heavily influenced, I gather, by Montessori methods and by methods that are still current today, the Waldorf school, Rudolf Steiner, and the like. So there was a sense in which this early progressive education, this sense of duty to the larger world, motivated him. But what's interesting is how he responded to those problems. So instead of just writing polemics or writing advocacy pieces, what he did, not just looking at the data in a casual way, which is a common practice then and now, he really built new models, precise models, because he has training as a physicist. He wanted to lay things out clearly so that people who understood his work could criticize the work and improve it. I think he was always going forward and trying to create a better world and a better economics in the course of this. So I found this book to be, it's kind of like reading the mind of Newton, but understanding that what you're doing is this man was deeply concerned about social policy, and it shows up through every one of his works. I have, there's one piece of his work which I think is neglected. I wrote about in the essay I wrote on him. Early on in the 1950s, he wrote this incredibly insightful paper on the pricing of it was in a German journal, Weltwirtschaftliches Archive, and he was on the theory of income distribution. And if you look at it, it's a modern theory of income distribution in competitive markets. He was really talking about how prices of heterogeneous goods would actually then translate into incomes that individuals would earn. And then not only did he write these models down, he estimated the models and he fit the models. I have a personal story to tell about that paper. I was in Rotterdam years ago at a conference. It was with Tom McCurdy, who's now at Stanford. The 2 of us were there at a conference, and Tinbergen came. And we commended him on this paper, which really was the precursor to what we call modern hedonics. In fact, in many ways, it's not just the precursor, it's the foundation of modern hedonic pricing models. The later models became more specialized and in some sense less inclusive. And to me, it's very interesting that in fact, in recent work on the pricing of multi-attribute goods and the pricing of services in the labor market, that in fact, the Tinbergen framework has been rediscovered and enhanced by people like Ilse Lindenlaub and so forth at Yale. So what we can see is the structure of engagement with real problems led to real science. And I think this is a general rule that comes out of knowledge creation. that really it's the engagement of real problems and trying to understand them precisely and understanding its limits. So in his later books on income distribution, Tinbergen used these models. And he used these models to suggest particular social policies to try to attack inequality and to promote social mobility. So I think what's an interesting synthesis in this book, it provides us with a deep understanding that here was a man who was a pacifist. He was an active pacifist to the end. I guess he grew up right across from the Peace Palace in Den Haag, and it was definitely influenced by this structure of social planning and of well-being, of trying to create a society that was inclusive, that was free of war, that was in some sense utopian socialism. But he went about it in a way that was non-polemical. He went about it, and it seems like from what, I only met him this one time. And what was interesting at that one time is that when McCurdy and I were actually complimenting him on the article, he suddenly got up and said, no, I have to give you something. So he ran up, he was at his university office nearby. He went up to his university office and he gave us an erratum. And he said, look, the paper has a mistake and you have to read this paper. You have to read this page. And there it was. It was a minor mistake. I mean, some kind of quadratic form that was kind of mistyped, or this was 1956, this paper, and presumed. So this was like in the 1990s. He was so passionate about getting it right and so deeply scientific. But but more importantly, it's not just the fact that he was a scholar deeply committed to knowledge. What percolates through the book and through all the writings I was familiar with as a graduate student, and I know today, I think it's still very current, although I think the notion of social planning, the way that he forecasted, I think that's died out in the mainstream of economics. But I think the models that he used to create models for social planning, those are alive and well today. So I think it's a great occasion to celebrate not only Tinbergen, but the fact that this book is such a nice summary of his work. And unlike most books on economists, or a lot of books, period, about people who are primarily known for technical work, it puts them in context. And it gives us a much deeper insight as to what motivated him, why he spent as much time as he did. He spent a lot of time in less developed countries near the end of his life. Again, his concern about poverty, his concern about inequality and promoting society. And so even though some of his lessons, messages have been ignored and neglected, the corpus of economic theory that he created has not been ignored. And I think that even though his enthusiasm, he and his fellow laureate, Ragnar Frisch, really strongly believed in central planning in a way that I think has become less fashionable today, nonetheless, he created a framework for thinking constructively about economic policy. And it's interesting that it was so heavily motivated, so deeply motivated by the concern to improve society. And in some sense, I don't want to belittle his contribution, but if you read the life of Marshall and you ask, Marshall, what did Marshall wrote on several occasions that his, mostly famous for his work on price theory and industrial organization and creating a whole corpus of economic theory. But Marshall, and it's visible in his own career, Marshall was deeply interested in the problems of poverty. And so in getting to the core of the problems of poverty, he had to understand the mechanisms that were producing it. And in that sense, I think it was a very constructive synthesis that was able to straddle the kind of Marxist socialism that was prevalent in some of the social planning circles, and some of the structures of neoclassical economics that were emerging at that time. Tinbergen made a very nice synthesis. And it wasn't just because he was aesthetically motivated, it's because he saw the best in each and tried to create something useful. So those are very shallow remarks, and I will say that I deeply appreciate and have always appreciated Tinbergen, not just for the econometrics, very important, of course, his theory of economic policy, and his work on development planning. Those showed a real willingness and ability to engage with the real world and to enrich economic theory for doing so. So I'll stop at that. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this occasion. It's a good book.
Thank you, Jim. I think you gave a very rich picture of Jan Tinbergen, also how he shows up in the book. I agree with everything you said, except for the last remark that it was shallow, because that it was not. I think you got a lot of deep insights, I think, in the work of Jan Tinbergen. I have two questions for you. One is, this book also shows, and you quite rightly point out that it describes the context, and it brings out also the person of Jan Tinbergen. And I was sort of wondering to what extent you identify with the person of Jan Tinbergen, or what do you think in your own work, your own life, it is different for you. You talked a great deal about the social responsibility that Tinbergen sensed. What we also witnessed somewhat in your work. So I was just intrigued. Do you identify in any way with Jan Tinbergen?
Oh, yes, in several ways. When I was an undergrad, Tinbergen wrote his PhD in physics. And I started in that course, but like Dan McFadden did as well, as a matter of fact. And I think Koopmans did write his PhD in physics, or either that or in mathematics, but that's an earlier generation. But where Tinbergen's problem in the time of, in his day, when he began, he was living in the middle of the Depression, or the Depression started, let me put it that way. He was a brilliant student. I saw one line in the book says, that it was rumored that it was both, only two people understood Einstein's theory of general relativity, and that was Tinbergen and Ehrenfest. I don't know if that was true, but he clearly was a brilliant student, and he was really somebody who could make a tremendous impression on anybody. But we started, and he had these earlier roots in socialist camps and works with people. He was motivated, quasi-religious. I think it was kind of a secular religion for him, maybe. Yeah. And this became a theme, I think, for many, many economists. I used to kid around, a lot of people who were previously deeply religious sometimes turned to economics or turned to some kind of belief and some desire, maybe a secular God, if you will, but in the sense of, trying to do better in the world and trying to make the world a better place. And to an extent I've written about this. I don't want to go on about myself, but I did have some deep religious roots when I started out. And in that sense, I somewhat commiserated with him. But I entered economics at a different time. And that is, it was the 1960s. And it was already at the time when people like Tinbergen and others had already, and Klein, and for that matter, Friedman, and a number of others, Arrow, and so forth, had created this edifice of neoclassical economics. And Kennedy, President Kennedy, he was a president when I was an undergraduate, was deeply interested and implemented economic policy. And so there I had, different from Tinbergen, the sense that economics could be a successful science in shaping policy. So the Kennedy tax cut and the ensuing analysis was very inspiring. So I had a different source of inspiration. And also then I lived through some of the disappointment that came in the aftermath of those social policies. So there's a sense that I can't say I'm Tinbergen. I have very different motivations, but I did sympathize with the fact the training in physics, the training in science does drive me. I can still see, does to this day. I was yesterday over the weekend, we were working on a very detailed appendix to a paper that's really very applied, but nonetheless, we went through a series of very intricate calculations, formal calculations, in an effort to try to understand and create a clear story about a particular intervention that we were studying. And in that sense, I think I share some background with Tinbergen. And I always felt that there was this kind of science. And other people feel the same way. I know that there's one of my contemporaries, in fact, my co-laureate, Dan McFadden, started out in physics as well. And if you read his works, and you read a lot of his work, he has this same notion of the physicist, going out, doing models, and then looking at data and trying to test the models with data. So there's a practical focus. It's not just an aesthetic enterprise. So that's what I would share with Tinbergen. And I feel a blood brother in that regard. I think he's a powerful source. And also, so in that sense, I feel some commonality. I was not a Quaker. I thought about becoming one during the Vietnam War, but not for the reasons that Tinbergen wanted to think about being a Quaker. I was really trying just to get out of the draft. So literally, Tinbergen was a very inspirational figure.
Thank you.
But I do think it was amazing how he put this to work. And the other issue, sorry, I'm giving you too long an answer here, but the part that I found also motivating, I grew up in the era of civil rights activity. Yeah. I spent some time in the South, traveling around, working in the South, and so forth and so on. That work has deeply influenced my career. And in that sense, the engagement, the understanding black-white inequality, understanding exactly what the issues are, has motivated my work for decades. I've written on it. I'm probably less well known for that in the general economics profession, but it's something that has motivated me and motivates me to this day to understand what are the sources of inequality, how things went wrong in the United States, how things might get better, and what we might do. So in that sense, I share that the social milieu shaped me in that regard, but it was a totally different context. And I think Tinbergen was truly an amazing force. And the circles in physics that I traveled in, I knew people like Robert Oppenheimer and people like that, and studied with them a little bit, but nothing to the extent of Ehrenfest and Einstein and Fermi. There's a great picture showing these guys together, all kind of amazing, I thought.
Thanks, Jim. Please, if you have a chance, stay with us, because we may...
Okay, no, I'd be very curious. I should probably be turned off the screen, though. You don't want me to comment, I think, on the commentary,
no, maybe
right?
At one point, let's see how it works. And maybe the questions may also be directed at you. But let's see how it works in the next
okay, fine. No, I'm happy to listen. So please, I went on
because in a way, you did already a lot of, a big part of the job also highlighting the personality of Jan Tinbergen. And I want to now sort of focus on you, Erwin, because you wrote the story. You spent years studying Jan Tinbergen. And although I thought I knew him, I discovered that he is a much richer personality with a background that I knew existed, but I think you give so much more relief to it. And if you allow me one anecdote, Jim told an anecdote. I have also my Tinbergen anecdote. I was a young student, and Tinbergen just won his Nobel Prize a few years ago, and he came to give a lecture at the University of Amsterdam. The room was packed. I was sitting in the middle, and of course, I think his talk was about development economics and the environment. And so afterwards, what you do as a young student, you go to the master and try to talk to him. No chance. So I got my bike, and what I did pick up is that someone offered him a ride. That's what I picked up. I got my bike, and I was biking, and at one point, I saw who was standing there all by himself, waiting for the tram, the great Jan Tinbergen. And I was too shy to approach him because that was, of course, would have been a chance. But that is the modesty that characterized the guy. That was one theme that preoccupied you, right? Yeah. So tell me, what was your most your insight in his person?
Well, I think it's this image that we have of him, right? Trained in natural science, doing econometrics, being a technical person. And the trams, right, from a very young age fascinated him. And, right, his family wanted to go out into the woods. And he was studying the tram schedules, right? So in some sense, he has a beta mind, right? A technical, exact mind. But I think that the thing that opened him as a person to me was the social motivation, but not merely the social motivation, right? Because that can be relatively abstract, right? You can be a socialist in a quite abstract sense. I think that is somewhat true for Charlie Koopmans, who's discussed often in the book, that it remains a somewhat a far-fetched utopian vision. And for Tinbergen, it was always a problem in the here and now. And it was also a way of shaping his own life. So the way that Professor Heckman told about his own visits to the South or traveling around the South.
Yeah.
Right? This is something that Tinbergen did from an early age. Encouraged by his mother, he went to the fishermen in Scheveningen, who were the workers in The Hague, and then in Leiden again. He was sent to the slums to see how these people lived. And that was a way of understanding. And this is also something he emphasizes. Despite being a beta guy, he says, no, it's about verstehen. We have to understand how people live their lives and how they give meaning to it, and how we can improve their lives. And in order for that, that's really an emphatic process, not merely a sort of hard-minded, square process.
Yeah, and that's, my Jim also told a story, indeed, as you refer to, and in some way or another, when I was reading your book, I think Tinbergen, I think Deirdre McCloskey is watching too, is a humane economist, right? He has these truly human values that he brings to the field. And I find that very inspiring, the way you write that. In a way, it's also what Jim also brings up. And in a moment, I will talk with Philip Hahn about it, because I think that has changed. But isn't that something that characterized him? I mean, he was so principled, living a modest life, right? Being dedicated to these social causes throughout his life, while he then also started doing development economics.
Yes, absolutely. So that shapes his work. But I think that's also the one element where I think there's a dual legacy, right?
Yeah.
I set that out in the final chapter, is that Tinbergen left behind the technical legacy. Right? In the Netherlands, we always joke that we are the only country that has econometrics as a separate field, which is due to Tijl and Tinbergen. So there's a sense in which I think his legacy has also been to almost split the two apart, right? To turn econometrics into a science of its own, and technical economics into a science of its own. And it almost being disconnected from this social and quasi-religious inspiration that he was for others, right? And those two groups exist. And so there are two legacies of Tinbergen. And when you talk with his family or his co-workers from the past, right, you discover that typically they are in one camp or the other. So in some sense, it's not that we've lost it, but it remains hard to connect the two. And sometimes for Tinbergen, it was also hard to connect the two. When you're a neutral economic expert, you cannot always also let your ideals or your social goals speak.
Yeah.
And so he also had to balance the two.
He also was a hard-headed guy. I mean, I was fascinated by all the conflicts and controversies that he seemed to be drawn in. I mean, Keynes, my other hero, other big reason why I studied economics. And it was much more vicious, actually, the comments that he got, than I knew from the correspondence that always is referred to.
Yeah.
And it was pretty tough.
Yeah, it was tough, but Tinbergen was a pacifist not just in politics, but also in science. So when Tinbergen was criticized, and lots of people tried to draw him out, and sometimes he was even encouraged as a show by his friends to respond sort of in an equally polemic way, but he didn't do so. Right? He said, no, there must be a way that we can find a synthesis between your view and my view, or some way to improve the models that we're working on. So he's very, very much a pacifist in science, which as a biographer, right, occasionally is a bit of a letdown. I mean, a nice comeback from him would have perhaps been sexier, but it characterizes who he was, right?
Yeah.
And the personal element of science for him had to go to the background. We had to talk about, as Professor Heckman also emphasized, the data, the models, and finding a language that you and I shared. Even though we belonged in very, very different camps, or we lived on another part of the world, we had to find a shared language in which we could talk with one another.
Another theme, where a good reason for people to read the book, is that, as you just said, there was also in his work sort of a shaping of how we look at the economy. Jim was also referring to that. And first he was really looking at it as a natural scientist was looking at it, but he's actually most deepest impact was his formulation of economic policy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's basically, and I think this is on a conceptual level, I like to think that this is not always appreciated about Tinbergen's work, that in the 1930s he's a business cycle theorist. And everybody in the 1930s in economics was a business cycle theorist or a business cycle empirical person. They were all studying the Great Depression in one way or another. But whereas those models were continued by many people, many of the people that were mentioned, Lawrence Klein perhaps most prominently among them, but indeed also from other sides with Milton Friedman, that was not true for Tinbergen. So Tinbergen sort of said, okay, yeah, it's interesting to describe and analyze the economy, but our real goal is to direct it in the most desirable direction that we can think of as a society. So he didn't want to impose that, right? That's the neutral expert in him. He wanted not to impose which direction it should go, but he said our model should enable us to steer the economy, to shape it so that it leads to just outcomes or to growth.
But it was at that time unheard of, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, but even the 1930s evolution is sort of radical in the sense that many people have studied this. The word "the economy" didn't really exist before the 1930s. So there were various industries, and there were financial markets, and there were industrial markets, but there was no the economy. And so the 1930s invention, which I think was more Keynes doing perhaps than his, was to invent or imagine the economy. But then the 1950s step was to imagine it as a system that you could steer, right? In the famous language of his, of instruments and targets, that you could steer it in a direction that you wanted to. So there's a sort of dual revolution in first imagining the economy as an object and then also imagining how we could operate it.
Yeah, so when I started studying in the 70s economics, I didn't know any better. That's the way we looked at it, as a machine that you could steer with targets and knobs to turn on. And Esther, Miriam, you also you studied in the United States. You were at Stanford, working with Arrow. You studied the work of Sargent. Then you came back here to the Netherlands, developed your interest in, among others, behavioral economics. You are also now a policy maker, or at least you are in the Senate, or the Dutch Senate. So you're politically active, and you did also serious conversations about the work of Tinbergen, including a conversation with Jim Heckman. Now, I wanted to ask a second question, Jim Heckman. I'm asking you that now, because Jim Heckman is University of Chicago. And isn't it true that the University of Chicago is part of the undoing of the legacy of Tinbergen? Dus the whole idea that you model the economy was declared basically mute by the Chicago economists, including Sargent and Lucas, of course. Isn't that the case?
There are many, many elements in your question. I'm going to respond to a few of those.
Yeah.
One is a big difference in the transition in the Netherlands and in the United States. In the Netherlands, I was trained in the Tinbergen fashion. And then I came to Stanford, and my instructors there were not interested whatsoever in policy recommendations. They were interested in fascinating mathematics, and they were willing to help with the mathematics, but not with the assumptions or with the applications. So that was one of the reasons I was thrilled to go back to the Netherlands, to be in this environment in which economics and policy interact. And I think one of the legacies in which Erwin describes in his book is the influence that Tinbergen had on the institutional landscape we have in the Netherlands, with the special position of the Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis, the special position of the Central Bureau for Statistics. That's quite unique, that we give a role to those institutions in guiding us in policy directions. So that's part of the answer to your question, but that was more because of your introduction than because of what you mentioned later on. Then if you look at the discipline of economics and how it changed from Tinbergen to Chicago and to the present day situation, you see in Tinbergen and in the early Coles Commission this wish to connect theory and policy. Theory is measurement. And then later on, Coles changed its motto to theory and measurement. And if you look at the economics profession now, I would characterize it as a profession that has made an applied turn, that looks at several elements of the economy in great detail, comes up with fascinating findings like Angus Deaton, whom we interviewed for the book, things that you wouldn't think of in your armchair of theory. But that is quite different from the earlier inspiration of Tinbergen. So you see a drifting away from this building of bridges between theory and policy and application and data towards more of an applied turn looking at several separate elements of the economy.
You are a member of the party that also Tinbergen was a member of, right? Is Tinbergen still important in the party of the party of the labor, as we would say?
Yes. In fact, when I was reading the great book that Erwin wrote, I had to do some soul searching, and because I was inspired, just like Tinbergen, in wanting to improve the world. I come from a background where soberness and moral duty play an important role.
Also religious.
Not religious, so I saw many connections, and it also forced me to rethink. Am I at a point in my career where I'm living up to those ambitions that I had, that Tinbergen had, and what steps do I need to undertake to live up to the high standards that I started out with?
Yeah, I was inspired by Tinbergen not to take a car. I didn't live up to that promise. I was just realizing I should get rid of my car to honor his.
But I think one other thing, because it's interesting that you mention also your own career switch, is that for numerous times he could have, in my sort of imagination, could have lived the professor's life, and he repeatedly chose not to live the.
He could have gone to Harvard, right?
He could have gone to Harvard, which for us Dutch people perhaps feels a little bit like, right, the good life of the professor. I'm not sure whether that would have been fully true. That would have been breaking with a lot of things, but it was also moving in sort of topics, setting up new institutions, thinking, okay, I've done this very well. That means that there's a new moral duty for me somewhere else. And so I should move on. And the amount of times he did, even at 50 and 60 years old, was truly inspiring.
Yeah, Philip, Hans, you were instrumental of getting this book also done, right? I mean, you were the dean here of the economics faculty, and you decided this had to be done. Were you aware of what it would lead to? Did you know Tinbergen? Were you familiar with his life?
I'm familiar with his life due to a former book written by Albert Jolink on Jan Tinbergen. That's more on the personal life. I met Tinbergen once when he visited the Tinbergen Institute, named after him, and in the building close to the river. In 2017, I think Erwin started to write his book. Before that, there were already plans to have something like that. And in those days, we thought it would be nice if we could combine it with celebrating his first Nobel Prize 50 years before, in 1969. And the lucky coincidence was that we invited Esther Duflo to be one of our honorary doctorates. And just right that year, in 2019, she got a Nobel Prize for economics, also on topics that really address what Tinbergen also addressed. Using modern techniques, perhaps simpler econometrics with all kinds of random control experiments, very, very well written pieces. So it all came very nicely together. We would have liked, of course, in the very same year to present this book, but I also have written a few books and it takes always longer than you think. But I think the end result is way deserving this time. This is a marvelous book. As I said, I read the Dutch version, not yet the English one, but it's extremely well written. It's very inspiring.
And you are, what you could say, a contemporary economist, do a lot of research, do a lot of econometrics too. How do you relate to Tinbergen's legacy? I once interviewed you when you were a graduate student still. For the book about Tinbergen that I wrote then. You were one of the students, I think, in my sample. And
a long time ago.
A long time ago. I identify you more as an American-oriented economist. Is that right?
Not so much. I think we are still working today in the spirit of Tinbergen. Business cycles, still very, very actual. The main thing, I think, what is the difference is that the world has become much more complicated than it was in the 50s. So I think, I do not know by heart, but maybe his models have a few equations, and the ones where the Central Planning Bureau in the Netherlands works with is a 2000 plus. set of equations, where even after the recent recession, people said there's a block of finance missing, so something like 500 equations are lacking still.
Yeah.
And that's of course very interesting and intriguing. And people still try to work in similar ways to have methods and techniques to reduce poverty, as the flow, but also to forecast better, to control the business cycle, to reduce its the oscillations. So it's still alive.
Still very much.
And that is what I find that comes together with what Esther Mirjam said. It's quite amazing that the institutions that you mentioned, they're still here.
Yeah.
And they're still, I also presented this to a Chinese audience, and they are still independent.
Yeah.
So we have the modelers, the forecasters, the policymakers, and they are different people.
Yeah.
And still up to date. And we even have the SER, which is a committee that involves...
impossible to explain to Americans.
That's a committee that involves unions and employers.
Yeah, together.
And they do not seem to fight. They make solutions and they present it to
They're
government.
called social partners.
So the whole, the sympathetic part of Tinbergen, I sense still, around us today.
Yeah, because Erwin, now we talk about how great and nice and good Tinbergen was, but in your last chapter you had also some qualifiers that there is also reason that Tinbergen could get also somewhat disappointed. So what is your message there?
Well, I think there's 2 points. I think one point on development economics. I think development economics, as he practiced it in the 1960s and 70s, is certainly not enjoying a good reputation. But I think also in hindsight was, when you look back at it, was often misguided. It was very, very top down, which by Tinbergen's own standards, in some sense, was not okay. Like I show in the early part of the book that it grew out of social movements, out of an intimate knowledge of the problems, and in the development economics that goes missing. So he was a little bit of fish out of the water abroad, and so in the developing countries, there's people always ask about, and what about Albert Hirschman? Albert Hirschman is famous for having lived in nearly every South American country and then having a sort of intimate knowledge of the social norms and all the different groups in those societies. That was not true for Tinbergen. So I think if we look back at his development economics, we see that he lacked some of the intuition and some of the non-measurable knowledge, perhaps, that made him such a great economist in the Netherlands. And then, secondly, I think there's real questions that we should ask about the way he institutionalized expertise. So indeed, in the Netherlands, it's unique. We have these expertise institutions, but you also see that an economic expert, and that is how I present Tinbergen, somewhere between academia and the policymakers, and always trying to build that bridge, had a tendency in him, even despite all his modesty and all his personal qualities, had a tendency in him to ultimately he wanted to have the experts have the last word. And that didn't always match with what society wanted. And in the 1950s and 60s, there was a sort of general belief that we were going to build a great society together. But in the 1960s, when the revolts happened, the student revolts, he is upset. He doesn't know what to do. And in fact, then his sort of his response, his intuition is to fall back on more expertise. So the problem that things are not going as we had planned is because we didn't have enough expertise, or we didn't know all that we should have known. And I think perhaps that is a moment that he should have thought, well, for me the place is now humility, and it's listening again. I should go out again and understand what this revolt is about. And I think that's also a lesson for today, if we think about expertise today, right, which is sometimes challenged from all sorts of angles. Our response should not be, then we need more equations, or we need more expertise, or we need better measurements. Sometimes it's also then important to go back and listen, like he did in his early parts of his career, and to also think of our role as economists not mainly working in service of the state, as Tinbergen did more and more, but also working in service of society. And he did not always, I think, walk the right balance on that front.
Yeah, because it was interesting in your response also, because there is the role of the expert is really on the question. Now, we don't even have to talk about the United States, but I rarely see people like you or Philip Hahn on television being asked what we think. Is that your experience too? And what does that mean?
For the longest time, the economists were the experts because they were the hardest of the social sciences. Scientists, they all came with physics backgrounds, actually going back to Edgeworth.
Yeah.
So Tinbergen is not the first one and certainly not the last, von Neumann with game theory. So for the longest time, economists were able to present themselves as the hardest of the social sciences. But then we got difficulties like the recommendations in the Vietnam War that didn't quite come out. Schelling's role in the Vietnam War, the stagflation in the 1970s. So now you see the expertise being shifted. In the Netherlands, it's not only the Netherlands Bureau of Economic Policy Analysis, but it's also the Social and Cultural Planning Bureau. It's also the Planning Bureau for the Environment. And that is parallel to a development where we're not only looking like President Kennedy did to gross domestic product and economic growth, but we're looking at well-being in a broader perspective. And I think with that broader perspective on well-being, it's also good to look at a broader range of expertise, not only from the economists, but also from the other actors.
And Tinbergen would have agreed with that, don't you think?
Well, I'm actually, I was going to ask Erwin this. Do you think that Tinbergen would approve of this switch towards a broader sense of well-being, switch towards various agencies playing a role in policy making?
Yes, very much so. So on the Social and Cultural Planning Bureau, there was actually a cultural department at the Planning Bureau for Economics, which didn't really take off and which ultimately was terminated. So he already had an eye for that. And later on, he also wanted to include, especially psychology. He always looked at the psychologists as somehow being good at measuring things. And I think if you now look back at what happened in economics, it's interesting that's also the psychologists were the ones who were finally able to breach the thick walls of economics, right? And find an entry point also later in happiness research. So I think there's an appreciation for it. But Tinbergen had one standard, one defining feature. You had to be able to measure it. And if you weren't able to measure it, then scientifically it couldn't count. However important it was, and he recognized it to be in his own life, you had to measure it in order for it to count scientifically. And that's sometimes, right, that steers where you look. And I think as critical economists, we know that all too well, but that sometimes means that we look in places that are easier to measure and don't always look in the other places. But yes, he was already thinking about broader senses of measure, of welfare and well-being, but only to the extent that they could be measured. So,
I have
Professor
a question also.
Professor Heckman wants to come in.
Yeah. There was a line of work in the 60s and 70s that Tinbergen helped initiate. Van Praag, for example, and several other Dutch.
Yeah, we are trying to get back in touch with Professor Heckman. In the meantime, let me see.
Okay, well, it's okay.
Yeah, we are back with you, Jim. You want to say something?
Oh, I just wanted to reaffirm this point about Tinbergen's interest. I was going to refer to the work in the 1960s and 70s that was inspired by Tinbergen, by people like Bernard van Praag and others. They were working with Tinbergen. They came up with measures of utility. And exactly, I remember when they came through, University of Chicago, for example, they were literally trying to think about measurement utility for precisely this purpose. It wasn't just the utility of a particular good, but the utility even of society at large. So there was an attempt, I think Tinbergen, but it was a measurement framework. And if you look at it, you can see he developed, Van Praag and his co-authors, developed a whole set of tools. And you can see it. They're in print today, left over. And I would call that an early precursor of the happiness literature. And for that matter, even Frisch, was deeply concerned about the measurement of utility for precisely the point of view of going beyond just looking at bundles of goods, but thinking of broader notions of happiness. So I think it's been a concern for quite a while, and I think Tinbergen was active in fostering research on it.
Thanks.
Footnote comment.
I have a question of Daniel Verhemert, directed both to you, Professor Heckman, and to Erwin. What Daniel remarks is that Tinbergen and you yourself, Jim, have added greatly to the toolkit that economists have to find the truth. We have seen since then lots of tools being added, including neuroeconomics and RCTs. And the question that Daniel has, they want you to look into the future. And actually the question is, what would Tinbergen be working on today?
So let me start on that one. But I think one thing I note in the book is that he wanted to develop a scientific measure for sustainability. So this is once again such an example of. So this is an important normative concept, right? That everybody is using as a concept and is also using as a guiding principle. But in order to truly work as a guiding principle, Tinbergen felt that you had to develop a measure of sustainability. And already in the early 90s, that was the very end of his life, but by now it's about 30 years ago, and he published a method that was, I think, somewhat data intensive, if that's a word, right? It required a lot of estimations of various projects, but that was an attempt to measure how sustainable the economy was at the moment, and how we could work toward making it more sustainable through measure, right? By measuring the impact and especially the compensation projects that we did. So if you think of right now that we buy an airplane ticket and some trees will be planted, right? That's the sort of thing he had in mind. And then the natural functionings that our generation had, we had to transfer to the next generation. And so he wanted to provide a scientific measurement for how to do that.
And Jim, do you have an idea?
Well, I think the theme that's been sounded throughout this whole discussion is that of measurement. Yeah. And my guess is now that he would be delighted with the whole set of tools that have emerged, not just in econometric methods, data learning, new machine learning technology, but new ways to elicit things like not just preferences, but to capture moods, and I think to capture the well-being. One project that Tinbergen was interested in, and certainly Frisch was interested in, when he used the concept of social welfare function, he wanted to quantify that function. I think he would still be interested in trying to capture a richer notion. And my guess is, because of the developments that have occurred in the last 50 years or so, that he would be very interested in trying to understand the heterogeneity and diversity that characterizes preferences and characterizes the competing policy visions of across different groups. From what I can see in his writings, he was conscious of that, but he had some very crude data when he was writing. But he mentioned he mentions these things in his books on income and equality, the competing visions and so forth. So I would guess that would be one key goal that he would have, to try to quantify more deeply and then use that quantification to guide policy. I think that would be something very, very, I'm not sure how we would look into the political economy that's currently practiced. And I think he would probably find it interesting and might participate in it, but I don't see a lot of shreds of thinking. Maybe Erwin has this some knowledge of that. I don't think I don't know of any body of work that he wrote on particular of the democratic process and how social decision making. I don't know how he took even Arrow's impossibility theorem in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, the welfare function was central to his work. I mean, he talked about it. He wanted to quantify it. He did. And so did Frisch, as a matter of fact, tried to. But I think he would probably want to go further in understanding of the political economy of choice and debate.
Thanks. We almost come to the end. Two long questions, but short answers, please, Erwin. There's one question about his switch. He is a physicist. And social engineering doesn't come natural to a physicist. But in a way, that's the story that you tell, right? That he made that switch.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things that is indeed somewhat puzzling. He studies with Paul Ehrenfest, who is a very theoretical physicist, so really thinking about models and fundamental explanations about how the world works, which is very far away, right? Natural science can be used to develop technology, but that's not really where he was. He was close to a lot of friends who studied at Delft, and which is much more an engineering school. And I think it's also important to take into account that even at that early period, this was not yet a university, but this was a school of economics founded by industrialists and traders in the city. So there was a practical bent to it, and that shows also in the institute that actually gets a lot of attention in the book, the Netherlands Economics Institute, which is basically economic consultancy before the word consultancy exists. And so there's a sort of practical side to it. And those were also the people who inspired him. Philips, Stork in the Netherlands, Henry Ford, if you think internationally, industrialists who were able to make things happen and thereby improve the world. And not so much not the socialist dreamers, but the socialist doers, if you like.
We have to conclude. I would like to finish by thanking Esther Mirjam Sint for contributing to this discussion, to Jim Heckman, of course, for your very lively introduction to and also clarification of the book. Thank you very much. And I also wanted to thank you, because you made this possible. You put your heart and also your resources to make this possible. But most thanks, I think, on behalf of many, is to Erwin, to bring Tinbergen alive in this great book. I think we owe you a lot for the hard work you did. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.